Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be back, microphone in hand, in the closet where the acoustics are better. I'd love to say that I've got like a professional podcast studio with, those sort of arms that hold you know what I'm talking about, those arms that hold the microphones and seats and headsets and YouTube ready. If I was going to actually film this and put it up on YouTube, you would see me sitting with my eyes closed, wearing my glasses, huddling in a closet by the clothes so that the acoustics are better. And, to boot, today's about like 40 degrees Celsius here in Montreal with the humidity. The fans are off, the air conditioning is off, everything to make sure that the audio for this recording is optimal. So you're welcome, and you're welcome. Anyway, I am happy to be holding the microphone again and to be talking to the listeners of the podcast. This is overdue, obviously, and there's a part of me that thinks that I should be more consistent with this, a weekly or bi-weekly recording, and maybe that'll happen at a certain point. I just feel like with everything that my schedule, I don't want to say demands of me, because it doesn't. I make my schedule, but with everything that I do, it would require the next level of organization on my part. I'm not there yet. With that said, I've been wanting to do a podcast episode on something for a long time, and today's podcast episode basically is the concept of don't speak for self, but rather speak from self. And I'm going to really break that down into what it means and what I mean by what I just said. But ultimately, if I'm talking about a part of me, or if I'm talking about self, understand that I'm referring to the psychological modality of internal family systems, which is something that I studied last year. I did the online circle program with the IFS Institute, and this was before they closed the trainings to non-licensed therapists. So I was very, very lucky to get in there while I could. But ultimately, I want to give you a very rudimentary understanding of internal family systems. Understand that it is a huge part of how I do my own personal mindfulness work. It is a huge part of the coaching side of my career and how I help accompany people. And so I just figured it would be helpful to explain what internal family systems is, and really break it down by tying it all together with mindfulness, with Hindu scripture, with the ego and human behavior, and all of that. I just thought it would be helpful. So here we are. Let me talk to you about internal family systems, and I'm going to explain it to you the way I usually explain it to clients when I start coaching calls with them. So if you identify a system is by default any entity that is multiple. So a government is a system, a school is a system, because there are multiple people involved in the organization. A family is also a system. Now, when a family, for instance, comes into family therapy, what will come to the surface is that there will be one family member who sees eye to eye with another family member. There may be a daughter and the father who get along, or a daughter and her brother who don't. There may be polarities and conflicts. There may be individual, family members who have a very specific opinion and private logic about a specific situation or about life in general that none of the other family members understand or even adhere to or agree with. But ultimately, when you have a family, or when you dissect a family, what you're going to see is that there are a lot of different people with different voices and different opinions and different logics. So internal family systems takes this concept of a family and everything that entails, with multiple people who have different personalities and different opinions and viewpoints, and it applies it to the mind. The mind is multiple. This is one of the core foundational building blocks of internal family systems. The mind is multiple. And what that means is we all have different parts. And the way that I spoke at the beginning of this podcast episode by saying there's a part of me that feels, that's literally the evidence right there. Every one of us has an inner critic part. Every one of us has an inner saboteur part. Every one of us has an ambitious part. Every one of us has a lazy part. Every one of us has a sexual part. Every one of us has a part that wants nothing to do with sex. Every one of us has a part that wants to squeeze the juice out of life, wants to travel, wants to eat, wants to meet the people and do the things. And then we also have a part that wants to do nothing and sit on the couch and just like vegetate, especially on a day like today when it is so hot and humid and crushing in Montreal anyway. So really, the mind is multiple. There are many different versions of you. And we are born with these parts. These are cognitive parts, parts of the mind. And we are born with these parts. We are also born with something that is referred to in IFS anyway as self-energy, and that's a capital S, self. Now, when I started to delve into IFS, it was this concept of self that really, really, really resonated with me, because self-energy is familiar to me simply because I've been working in the mindfulness and meditation and yoga spaces for so long. For those of you who meditate or do yoga or have any practice that ultimately helps bring the mind and the body together, you understand self-energy. Self-energy is that feeling at the end of a yoga class where you're in Shavasana and you just feel almost otherworldly. There's like a presence of mind, but there's also an absence of attachment to whatever is. There's a neutrality. And according to IFS, we can access self-energy whenever we want, and we will know that we are in self-energy or operating from self-energy as a mindfulness practice when there are states like calm or curiosity or compassion or openness or awareness, confidence, all of these things. And out of the ones that I mentioned, and there are more, IFS defines self with the 8 C's. And if you want to know what those are, you can Google it. But the C that really is fascinating to me is the C of curiosity. Curiosity is key. If you can be curious about a situation, you immediately, in my experience anyway, you immediately default, you bring yourself back to self-energy. And what that does is it helps strip emotion out of an equation, and that helps process and make decisions and move forward. Because very often, especially if you're an emotionally brained person, emotion can be the thing that sort of maintains paralysis or sort of sluggishness, immobility, that kind of thing. So anyway, we are born with self-energy. We are born with these cognitive parts. And these cognitive parts are in their own natural functions at birth. And what this means is if you're a parent, if you have ever been in the presence of children who are growing up, you see day to day that they grow sort of more and more into their personalities. Day by day, their personalities become more evident, more obvious. There are some kids who gravitate towards, getting on a table and grabbing a microphone and singing and entertaining. There are other kids who gravitate more towards grabbing a book and, going to read in a corner. There are children who gravitate more towards other children, and they want to be with other children. There's just like an innate social proclivity there. In other situations, you've got kids who want to be alone. And ultimately what you're seeing is that the cognitive parts of these children are directing them. So they're directing them down their own path. This could be the path of their dharma, but it is a natural, uninterrupted path. Now, What happens when a child encounters some form of conflict or some form of resistance or shock or hurt? And this happens to every child. At a certain point, a child gets hurt, whether it be somebody saying something to them and hurting their feelings and making them sort of overly self-aware. Sometimes it is realizing that your parents are not, the end all, and that at the end of the day, the way a protected child feels protected may not actually mean that they are as protected as they thought they were. Regardless of whatever happens, whatever potentially lands as trauma for a child, ultimately what happens to these cognitive parts is a part gets vulnerable. It becomes vulnerable or exiled. And this exiled or vulnerable part recedes a little bit. It stops whatever it was doing naturally. Its natural function is impeded and it recedes. And the other cognitive parts, what they also do is they get interrupted. They stop whatever their natural functions were and they go into protection mode. They protect the part that was hurt from ever getting hurt again. Now, these protection parts, there are two kinds of cognitive protection parts or protectors. Number one, there are managers. Managers are proactive. These are the parts of the mind that keep us moving forward, doing, accomplishing, maintaining the persona or the facade of everything is normal, everything is good. These manager parts are really the parts that help us continue to get our educations, to meet people, to be social, to build our lives, to be in family, to be in communication, to be, everything that our cultures tell us is part of the natural progression of a privileged life. Managers are proactive, and their motto is never again. So as much as they keep us moving forward and maintaining the facade of everything is normal, everything is fine, and in many cases helping us believe that and feel that, they also steer us in a way that has us completely avoid anything that looks like anything that hurt us initially and created these vulnerable or exiled parts. So managers keep us moving forward. They are proactive, but their motto is never again. Now, because life is life and life is going to happen, the managers occasionally are going to get tired, either because they're really struggling to keep us going forward in the presence of a lot of obstacles and a lot of adversity, or because something happens, because life happens just out of nowhere, and the vulnerable part gets triggered. What happens when the managers fail? Well, that's when the other protector parts kick in, and they are the firefighters. Firefighters are cognitive parts that are still in protection mode. It is vital to remember that firefighters are protectors as well. And firefighters, cognitive firefighters, do what real firefighters do. They break through every single thing in their path to put out the fire. And in this case, the fire is emotional overwhelm. So the protector parts are doing their work to make sure that emotional overwhelm is avoided. And if I'm being really honest, based on the work that I've been doing for years in coaching and all of the research and the studying that I've been doing, I think that every single human being is walking around on Earth doing their best to avoid emotional overwhelm. I think it is at the base rather, of people's behaviors and their logic. It is to avoid emotional overwhelm. Now, when the managers fail and the firefighters kick in by putting out the fire of emotional overwhelm through avoidance. And what that means is there's some form of avoidance that kicks in. The logic of the firefighters is do not deal with what is in front of you. Instead, do something that is going to anesthetize the emotional overwhelm. And usually, firefighter behavior looks like drinking alcohol, doing drugs, sitting in front of the TV for weeks on end, doing anything out of moderation. So eating too much food, binging on food or not eating food, restricting food. It could also be money, spending money stupidly, or being super, 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 super restrictive with money and finances. It could look like having sex irresponsibly, or going the opposite route and sort of closing down sexually. But ultimately, firefighter behavior kicks in to anesthetize from feeling the emotional overwhelm of how the exiled or vulnerable part was triggered. And so this whole sort of mind mapping kicks in when there is hurt. When there is an exiled or vulnerable part, the protectors kick in. They are created and they kick in. And when they kick in and they assume these new roles, these new identities. They have their own logic. They have their own opinions about everything. And ultimately, they stay in protection mode pretty much for the rest of time. Now, it is important to mention that the cognitive parts, the managers, the firefighters, are like actual little people in your mind. And this is in my mind, this is in all of our minds. The parts are like little people that exist in our minds. They have their own opinions, they have their own viewpoints, they have their own perspectives, they have their own languaging. They even have their own genders sometimes. You could have, if your body is female, you could have an inner critic part that is male. It is actually really fascinating. But what's even more fascinating is to acknowledge that these parts are constantly talking. They all have their own opinions. They want to be heard. They want to be acknowledged. And very often what will happen is they will blend, or they will sort of take over the controls of the body and the mind. So instead of operating from self energy, where, we are present, we are mindful, we are aware, the parts will blend. And that means that we will start to think through the logic of an inner critic part and start to be really, really hard on ourselves. Or we will get blended with, a firefighter that really wants to help us avoid feeling the deep, intense emotion. And so all of a sudden we'll be like, yeah, no, it's a good idea. I'm just going to sit down and have a couple of drinks. And 4 hours later and 10 drinks later, firefighter behavior has properly happened. Firefighter behavior typically is behavior that in the long term is not healthy, helpful, or sustainable, but in the short term is anesthetic. It helps anesthetize. It helps us avoid dealing, and it gets us through the period of time from being triggered again to when we can actually move past it by just keeping us anesthetized. All right? So this dance of awareness, of mindfulness between parts and self-energy, for me, is one of the most helpful practices. It's a practice that I use every single day, really. And it's a practice that helps me recognize when there are parts that are blended, when I am not operating from self-energy, when there is no calm, when there is no curiosity, when I'm not open, and when I'm into some way, shape, or form of negative thinking. And you will know that parts are present and operational, working on your logic, on your perspective, when there is some form of negativity. Parts, I would think, in almost every circumstance, manifest as something's negative. When we are in self, we can see the negative without actually being in it. And that's the difference. In my opinion, there is a mindful perspective, having that distance. So, when I say don't speak for self, speak from self, I believe that many people, when they speak for self, they're not speaking for the self that is compassionate or curious or open or clear or confident. They're speaking for a part. When we speak for ourselves, we're trying to make ourselves heard. And in my experience, that's like honking the horn of a car. You're trying to make sure that somebody else knows what you need to communicate. And the need to communicate itself, that comes from a part. When we're in self-energy, there's almost a peace with not needing to be heard or acknowledged. There's just a being in which we can find a sense of calm and a sense of peace. But when we are speaking for ourselves, I believe that is part. That's really a part that is blending with us and convincing us that this is necessary. And usually that is done to protect us from not doing whatever we feel compelled to do, or whatever the part has us feel compelled to do. Because the fear is, if we don't do this thing, if we just sit back and we actually aren't heard, maybe there is a fear of emotional overwhelm, of being insignificant or of being ignored or whatever. And that traces way back to childhood and back to, the initial hurts that occurred, the initial exiled parts that were created in childhood, in infancy, in adolescence, so on. So when we speak for self, this is coming from ego. And if I look back into Hindu scripture and to the Upanishads, which are simply the end of the Vedas, which are the oldest Hindu scriptures that exist, there, and I'm paraphrasing this, but there's a teaching, I'm sure I've spoken about it before in a podcast episode, but there is a teaching from the Upanishads that says that there is a difference between the pleasant and the good, and the wise prefer the good. And this teaching basically means that the difference between the pleasant and the good is that the pleasant is pleasant for the person alone. What's good is good for more than just the person. And so when we're trying to make decisions in our own lives, a good question is to ask ourselves, is this good or pleasant? If it's pleasant, it means that I'm the only one benefiting. And the risk of that is that it's a part that is benefiting. But seen from self, we recognize that this is just a way to feed the ego, or to feed the ego of this cognitive part. Something that is good would be good for the entire ecosystem of parts, seen or observed from a place of self. Okay, so basically when we look at the difference between speaking for self and speaking from self, speaking for self would be pleasant. Speaking from self would be good. We want to make decisions that are good sustainably. We don't want just pleasant for now. And very often having the drink or doing the drugs or zoning out in front of the TV or the internet, doom scrolling, all of these things, they're pleasant, but they're also long-term not helpful. They lead us into a sluggishness, into a laziness. And listen, that sluggishness and that laziness can be incredibly helpful if real trauma, and I shouldn't even say real trauma because all trauma is real, but if trauma is being triggered or relived or reawakened, of course it's easier to, look the other way, do something that helps us sort of shut down the part that is potentially saying, yeah, but hang on a second, we should look at this. Any access to self being shut down. So that we can avoid the emotional overwhelm. And again, I believe every single person on earth is walking around avoiding whatever their version of emotional overwhelm is. What we learn when we actually look at emotional overwhelm from self is that the fear of emotional overwhelm is worse than actually dealing in most cases. Very often, if we have the right resources, if we can get the right tools and the right people who potentially have tools that they can offer us, what that means is that the fear of dealing with something is worse than the dealing with something. And this has very much been my experience in life. And listen, I have to say, dealing with my stuff sometimes takes way longer than I wanted to. Sometimes it takes years. And you've got to be patient. And you've got to recognize that there is value in slow and steady winning the race kind of thing. But nonetheless, the more that we operate from self-energy, the more we are real with ourselves as we work with whatever it is that to us equates to emotional overwhelm or the fear of emotional overwhelm. I mean, I think the more we operate from self with these things, the better, because that is the path of wise response. It really is. And ultimately, the difference between wise response and emotional reaction, emotional reaction, that's parts that are blending and active and leading and taking the controls of the body. Wise response, that comes from self. That comes from mindfulness. That comes from awareness. It comes from, taking a deep breath so that you can integrate something between stimulus and response and shut down the natural inclination that the parts have to simply take over the controls of the vehicle so that you can take control of the vehicle from a place of clarity, even understanding, wow, these parts are active. My inner critic is like super active today. Being able to recognize that and to treat these parts as if they are people in your mind, it's super important. It's super important. It's super helpful. And ultimately, this is the path to healing. This model of internal family systems for me has been such a massive, massive, massive game changer in my own healing, in my own development. But I can't even begin to explain the role that it's had in my coaching service that I offer, and there's a part I think that just blended there when I said my coaching service. Seen from self, I'm not sure if this is a part that is finding fault with that. It might be an inner critic that's finding fault with it. I don't like to use the terms like me and mine. It's not my coaching service. It's the coaching service that I offer. Okay. And I'll sit with that for a little while and try and figure out, what's at play here. But this is a perfect example of being mindful and of just being aware of when a part takes over and feels the need to say something like, oh, that's mine. I've done that. There's not a lot of humility with parts. There can be a lot of shame. Every one of us has a shame part. Every one of us has an inner critic. And I can go on, but ultimately, I'm sure that by now this is resonating with you and you're already identifying some of your own cognitive parts that blend with you and that direct you, Anyway, I'm talking about all this because it's been a long time that I've wanted to talk about it in the context of the podcast. I want to get this out to more people. If you have any questions about IFS, please feel free to reach out. And of course, if you are interested in coaching, if you're interested in the coaching offering, knowing that this is a good part of it, a good chunk of it, please feel free to reach out. I don't have that much availability for new clients right now, but to be honest, I'm always open to helping people who need help or who even want help, or who think they want or need help. All I know is that standing in this role of accompanier and the person who is there as a resource for people, it seems to be resonating really well. The coaching offering is really, how can I say this? It has picked up more than I ever could have predicted. And so obviously something about, I guess, the way that it's coming through me and the way that I'm doing it and the way that internal family systems plays a role in that seems to really, really, really be resonating with people. And so listen, if that's something that interests you, please feel free to reach out in whatever way that you do reach out. So yeah, internal family systems, Google it. Look up Dick Schwartz, who is the creator of IFS. There's an incredible interview with Alanis Morissette and Dick Schwartz. If you Google that or YouTube that, it's a fantastic, fantastic interview. And yeah, just like look into it on your own, with me, with someone else, in whatever way, shape, or form feels right for you. With all of that said, I do need to apologize because there was a Leukemia and Lymphoma Society of Canada event that I was going to do in Toronto, and through all kinds of admin sort of changes, that didn't happen. So I was in Toronto, but not for the event. With that said, upcoming events include the weekend yoga and meditation retreat in Shefford, Quebec. That's August 1st to August 4th. The Greece retreat on the island of Paros, our annual excursion, happening September 7th to 17th of this year. There is room in both of those events. So if you're interested, go on to my website, bramlevinson.com, or contact me directly. And there will be more offerings. I am working so hard on my next book, Storyteller. I'm hoping to get it published by the end of the year. Trust me, you will know about it. And that's really it for me. I hope you are all listening to this in a moment in your life when things are more well than they are unwell. But if the inverse is true, don't keep that locked up in your mind. Speak to someone. even if it's just a perfect stranger on the street, maybe even speak into an empty room, just that you get it out of your mind. But understand that I am always a text away, I'm always an email away, and I really am here to accompany, and that's how I stand in my truth. So listen, have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day, rest of your evening, and listen, give it all a good think. I will see you soon, and I will have a retreat announcement coming up in the next few months for early 2025, so stay tuned for that. Thanks, everybody. Take it easy. Bye.